Officer Ryan drove the same peaceful section of the town's outskirts every morning until one foggy Thursday. He noticed a dirty, limping dog trotting by itself as if it had. Important to be curious. Therefore, Ryan chose to observe from a distance. He reasoned that perhaps the dog may have been hungry, but as the minutes went by and he continued to explore the woods, something told him this was no typical stray, and Ryan broke down in tears when he finally realized where the dog had taken him. Every town contains peaceful nooks and crannies where life appears to stop, and the only sound is the wind whispering through the trees. That peaceful lane on the outskirts of Pine Hollow has always been a regular spot for Officer Ryan Keller. Patrols the same meadows and forests, but before that morning, nothing had ever transpired there. Ryan was drinking lukewarm coffee in the early hours of the morning, just after sunrise, when the fog was still clinging to the grass like a blanket. When he caught a glimpse of something moving, it was a dog, not just any dog, medium-sized mute trudging down the path with matted fur and weary eyes. With an odd feeling of purpose, no leash, no collar, no owner's sign. Ryan reduced the speed of his cruiser, but the dog didn't stop or turn. It just looked back at him only once before continuing on. He had no idea why he had followed his instincts. Perhaps because of the dog's gaze on him. Something about it seemed human. The dog was attempting to communicate, but he didn't want to explain why he was limping and tailing. Wander across the forest. It sounded absurd, but he couldn't get the sensing that this dog needed to see something. He followed it slowly so as not to frighten it. The dog continued to, looking back as though to make sure he was still there. The road bends a few times. Ryan halted as he vanished into a well-worn dirt road that went through a thicket of pine trees. He was off duty and he departed after an hour because something inside of him constricted, even if this wasn't his work. The cruiser behind and entered the trees. The farther they walked, the more still it was. There were no birds or rustling sounds, only the crunch of dry leaves beneath Ryan's boots and the gentle patter of paws on soil. The dog finally came to a stop and stood motionless at the edge of a tiny clearing. When Ryan looked into the fog ahead, he noticed a creature that was initially hardly discernible due to its low ears and tail. Gradually became more apparent, and what he saw caused his knees to buckle under him and his throat to tighten. The dog hadn't just been wandering. Ryan stood motionless for a few seconds, his boots descending a little into the plush, moist woodland floor in front of him, half-veiled. An old, dilapidated camper with peeling windows and faded white paint was tucked away in the woods by morning mist. As if attempting to recover it from the forest, ivy scaled the edge of another boarded-up crack. This was no location that someone unintentionally discovered. The dog stood motionless, observing Ryan. With a stiff physique and beseeching gaze, Ryan took a hesitant step forward with one hand. He was taught to anticipate the unexpected, so he naturally rested close to his belt. Not on his weapon, but close enough. This was different. There was a peculiar weight to the silence, and the air was heavy with something unsaid. "Is someone here?" he said, his tone forceful yet quiet. And when he got no answer, he looked down at the dog that was now sitting near the trailer's entrance, its tail neatly coiled around its paws, eyes focused on the door. It waited for Ryan to approach the trailer without barking or whining. Gently looking about, there were no tire tracks or indications of new footsteps in the form of overgrown grass and fallen leaves. He ascended the groaning wooden stairs and knocked on the door twice, but nothing appeared. He looked, viewing the dog once more, who had not moved an inch. His heart began to beat more rapidly. A feeling of dread began to crawl into his chest. Something was seriously wrong. The door creaked open as it revealed a weak light once the handle was tested and unlocked. Ryan entered a disorganized room that smelled of damp wood dust and something else. It was stale and metallic. Gradually, his hand now securely holding the flashlight at his belt, the illumination pierced the night and fell upon a little shelves full of weird trinkets, old toys, a mattress in the corner, and an improvised table with some canned food and a picture, framed face down, and then he noticed it concealed in the trailer's far corner. Ryan's breath froze in his throat as he approached a small figure under a pile of blankets and carefully tugged the top blanket aside. A boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, who was pallid and still. His face was covered with dirt, and his chest rose and fell in gentle, faint breaths. His small hands were gripping a shabby stuffed animal, and his hair was matted and twisted. Naturally, Ryan fell to his knees. "Hey, buddy," he said in a catchy whisper. "Can you hear me?" the youngster asked. Didn't move, but thankfully he was breathing. He took out his radio and said, "This is Officer Keller. I urgently need an ambulance to come to my place, since I have a boy who is about 6 years old." "Hold on." He's breathing, but unconscious. He hurried outside to provide them with GPS coordinates, rattling them off with unanticipated speed and clarity. The dog was continuing to stare at him with eyes that appeared softer and more relieved even. Ryan whispered, "How did you know?" as he gazed at the animal as if it may respond. A few minutes later, the woods appeared, voices crackling over radios, sirens blaring in the background. Ryan remained, while the youngster quietly offered words of comfort and checked for injuries, despite the boy's continued. Ryan's heart stepped back as paramedics who were unable to respond arrived and delicately put the youngster onto a stretcher. His heart thumping as he watched the tiny, frail body vanish into the rear of the ambulance, he reported his findings to the medical staff and the responding officers, but he couldn't understand why something kept pulling at his thoughts. It was the dog. The dog watched from the edge of the clearing while the medics worked. As soon as the child was placed in the dog gave a quiet, almost melancholy whimper as the ambulance and door closed. Then, without hesitation, Ryan said, "Wait," as it turned and started to leave. "Hey, wait, come here." I followed it again, but the dog didn't run. It just paused, looked back at him before continuing to walk, but more slowly this time, as Ryan had no idea where this dog had come from or how it had discovered that trailer, but it was urging him to join it again, or how long it had been keeping watch over the child, but he was positive that Ryan was still following. The dog passed through the trees as the morning sun's golden rays began to emerge from the dense fog. The dog didn't turn around again. Instead, it continued to move between the branches that were creating lengthy shadows on the forest floor, moving through the underbrush with assurance, weaving as though it knew exactly where it was going. After around 10 minutes of, "Officer Keller, did you duplicate what the ambulance has?" Ryan's radio crackled as he was walking. Ryan pressed his microphone on the way to County Hospital, where the deceased child is stable. He didn't elaborate when he said, "I'm on foot following a lead." What was he intended to say? "I'm tracking a mysterious stray." The dog may be the only person who saw what happened here. The trail led to a rough hill. Ryan waited patiently at the top, scrambled up after it, brushed off his clothing, and froze when he got there. Below the crest was a deserted farmhouse with a half-collapsed roof, broken windows, and vines growing over every inch of wood the dog came down, and although it appeared to have been abandoned for years, it felt like it had just been inhabited. Ryan followed more warily, his hands resting on his ears as he gently listened. Flashlight once again, he could sense the constriction in his chest that typically signals a significant event. He had rarely been wrong with his intuition. As he got closer to the front door, he saw an odd pattern carve into the wood. Turret appeared as though initials had been awkwardly scribbled in by a toddler. Below it, a string of. Ryan wrote it down in his notepad in tiny lines and numbers, then pushed the door open. The first thing that struck him was the musty stench. Wet wood that has been covered in a more abrasive substance, such as rot or mildew. It was dark inside, and the boards creaked beneath his weight as he entered gently. His flashlight was moving from left to right, but there weren't any blank blankets on an old cot, food wrappers, cans, and a broken lamp on the floor. Recently, possibly even last night, and there's another little blanket in the corner. Ryan scooped it up from the mess that appeared to be a child's artwork next to it. It displayed a stick figure of a boy with a dog beside him and a sun in the sky. All of a sudden, it began with black fur, pointed ears that resembled the one outside. The boy had not simply stumbled into a trailer in the woods. Rather, he had been brought there or concealed, and this dog had recognized Ryan and had not discovered it by chance. Once more, the dog was sitting by the front steps, his tail thumping lightly as he watched, the drawing still in his hand. Ryan remarked softly, "You knew him, didn't you?" with cool, perceptive eyes. "We're defending him." The dog only stared at him, without moving or barking. Yet apparently, it was sufficient. Ryan's response, holding the drawing out while crouching. "Is this you?" The dog's eyes darted from the. After passing the paper to Ryan, it went back to the house, took a few steps to the side, and then sat down once more to wait for Ryan. He observed a patch of recently disturbed earth as he proceeded around the side. Subtle, but in his profession, little things frequently made the loudest noises. He knelt down and said, something had been buried here, next to the spot, and started to gently remove the leaves. Below the surface, there was a little heap of items. Damaged collar with a name tag, a baby blanket, a torn child's shoe, and a Lucky. Ryan's breath caught as he looked at the dog that was now standing quietly next to him. "Your name is Lucky," the dog said, but he didn't answer. Naturally, but Ryan sensed the solution in his gut. He re-examined the things his. Lucky had been living out here, not only surviving, but mind-blowing. Defending a child who had been stashed in the woods, far from any town or route, for unknown reasons. But, dispatch. Why did Ryan bring out his radio once more? "I need an evidence unit at my location. I may have a secondary scene with an abandoned building that shows evidence of occupancy, buried personal belongings, and animal control." But Ryan sat down on the porch while he waited for the backup, making sure they are nice because this dog is more than just a stray. The dog snuggled softly against Lucky's leg as he walked beside him. And for a brief, once more, the wilderness was quiet. A youngster was discovered by himself in a trailer that no one knew. There was an abandoned house with evidence of previous habitation and a dog that had lead him to everything, but it was just the beginning. The evidence team arrived in the afternoon and meticulously made their way through. Ryan greeted them at the edge of the opening in the forest with a quiet eagerness, and Lucky waited quietly by him like a. The authors swiftly proceeded to take pictures and list the objects discovered close to the property, while others meticulously recorded the interior. But Ryan's thoughts were still racing. He stood, looking toward the horizon, the old swing dangling from a limb, its rope frayed but still swaying gently in the breeze. He couldn't get the sketch out of his head. The child saw the sun and Lucky, however, Officer Keller, one of the evidence techs, had started to nag in the back of his mind. He entered the farmhouse once more and went to the back room, a tiny crawl space, and said, "You'll want to see this." A gap had been revealed beneath a loose floorboard, and inside were a number of plastic-wrapped objects, a child's rucksack, worn diary, and, most unsettling of all, a pile of pictures that Ryan squatted down and carefully looked over. Some harmless, a kid playing in the backyard grinning. Others more problematic, the same kid obviously the one. They discovered them seated in what appeared to be the trailer's bed that morning, looking terrified. Then there was a. Ryan's stomach dropped as he saw the picture of the youngster with the man in his late 40s. Narrow eyes and a disheveled beard, standing behind the youngster and smiling artificially. With a hand on his shoulder, Ryan tightened his jaw and gave the detective the picture. "We need facial recognition on." Ryan stepped outside Lucky while they scanned the photo and uploaded it to the state database. Ryan squatted down and scratched behind Lee's ear, after stopping just long enough to look back at the trailer. "You were with him the entire time, weren't you fortunate?" He cocked his head slightly before returning to his seat next to him, his gaze set on the Trian's body, tensed as if it sensed something more was about to happen. A few minutes later, his radio crackled. "We got a hit, Keller. The man in the picture is Thomas Marrow, an ex-con who worked for 5 years. Last year, the kidnapping was released on parole. No employer or known residence was provided, but it was noted. Recently, in relation to a complaint of a missing person, that boy, whose name is Eli, was kidnapped 3 weeks ago." Ryan's breath fled him like a blow to the stomach. 3. The voice on the other end went on. "We're sending weeks in those woods. Updated documents to your email right now. Additionally, Keller Mio is regarded as violent and armed, so proceed with caution, Ryan." I glanced down at Lucky, who showed me the way to that boy before anyone else did. "Look, how did you know?" It dawned on him abruptly that Lucky hadn't simply discovered the youngster and fled with him, or had attempted to retrieve the buried objects. Perhaps they had belonged to someone else, or perhaps Meow had originally owned Lucky. But something inside of him made his devotion to the child stronger than Ryan stood in terror and peered out into the trees once more. He's still out there. And Lucky knows it, Ryan muttered. The realization hit me like lightning. Turn to the others. I would need a 2-mile perimeter search to look for any signs of disturbed vegetation, footprints, or tracks. Marrow may still be nearby, and he might become alarmed if he witnesses all of this commotion. The crew moved swiftly, and Ryan remained near Lucky, who was pacing close to the tree's edge, his nose twitching and tail rigid. Ryan followed Lucky's gaze as he snarled a low, continuous sound deep in the woods just. A dark figure dashed between the trees beyond a ridge, moving too quickly to be A. Ryan yelled at the deer, "Hold your positions," and ran forward, pounding his heart. Lucky bounded forward, barking and now rushing, his headlamp bouncing against his side. With horrifying accuracy, they made their way through the underbrush to the ridge and came to a stop. Ahead, there was a creek, and on the opposite side, Lucky was already crossing with new boots and tracks going north. Ryan radioed an eye, splashing across the shallow water without trepidation. Keep an eye on a potential suspect who is walking away from the farmhouse to the north. With K. 9 unit unofficial, but believe me, he is skilled. He caught up to Lucky on the opposite side and proceeded. Every tree seems to be grabbing at him after the trail, and each step was louder than he wanted it to be. But Lucky moved as if he was designed to track down something he had been looking for weeks. Although Ryan kept it to himself, he knew deep down that this dog wasn't only a witness. He had saved Ryan's life and was now guiding him directly into the lions. As Ryan ran through the forest with twigs breaking under his boots, his lungs burned. Lucky was a dark blur just ahead of him, moving quickly but cautiously as he passed him in brown and green streaks. Nose to the ground, while using laser focus to follow the phantom path. The dog occasionally stopped to reevaluate before hurried forward once more with a fresh sense of urgency. Ryan had never witnessed such a chase. Ryan was now certain that Lucky knew who they were after because he had a past relationship with the man they were pursuing. The dog's low, focused tail and forward motion demonstrated that determination, not fear, was driving him. Ryan automatically raised a hand as he approached a deep grove, but no one was. He paused to listen to the silence behind him, then crunched Ryan down to a crouch and scanned the trees. Just beyond the clearing, something or someone was moving. At his side, Lucky stiffened. His snarl was hardly audible now, but his body was. Ryan reached for his sidearm, but failed to pull it, as if it were a coiled spring. However, he approached silently and slowly, and Lucky mimicked his movements like a professional. Partner Ryan eventually saw a figure moving through the branches. A dirty, unshaven man with ripped, filthy clothes was pulling something from behind a fallen wood, a tarp, and what appeared to be supplies or bags below it. It was Thomas. Marrow Ryan strengthened his hold on the radio, but he chose not to click the button. He could wait since he hadn't met him yet. But Lucky had other intentions before Ryan could. Mio spun as the dog charged forward with a powerful, resonant bark in response to a whispered instruction. Around with wide, shocked eyes, and for a moment Ryan saw Lucky meow's dread. Voice trembled with a mixture of anger and incredulity. "You followed me," but the dog didn't. Chargy halted a few steps away, yelling angrily and securing the man in place. "Ryan." I slipped and took that moment to view the Pine Hollow police hands. He suddenly raised his hands and exclaimed, "This isn't what it looks like," his rearward eyes darting between the dog and the officer. Ryan didn't lower his firearm, and since no one else cared, I snatched the child whose mother had abandoned him. "You abandoned the boy, who was comatose and dehydrated, in a trailer miles away from society. He was safe," Marrow yelled. "No," Ryan said sharply. "Lucky made sure of it not." Reply, "I made sure of it." The man's expression twisted, first in bewilderment and then in painful recognition. "You." Lucky snarled low as he spat, always getting in the middle and scurrying away. Unable to release the tightness in his shoulders, Marrow took a last-ditch stride back and ran away from Ryan. Took chase right away, with Keller pursuing the suspect who was running northeast unarmed. But, despite his slow speed, Meow was ferocious, crashing through bushes and taking unexpected turns. Lucky darted ahead, encircling him, blocking his way as if he was more familiar with the forest than Meow was. And finally, at the top of a steep, when Marrow stumbled in the gully, his foot hooked a path, and he fell hard. In a matter of seconds, Ryan was on him in the mud, his wrists snapped hard in cuffs. Ryan's voice pierced through like steel as I yelled and struggled. Enough, it's over. As officers, Lucky stood a short distance away, his tail motionless and his chest heaving. When Ryan arrived to arrest Marrow, he knelt next to Lucky and said, "You did good. You saved him." Lucky didn't wag, she added, gently removing dirt from the dog's fur. As if still monitoring and protecting, he simply sat with his tail and eyes fixed on the gully. Back at the station, the things started to come together. Weeks before, Thomas Marrow had abducted Eli from a nearby village. Understood the reason behind the inconsistencies in his statement. At times, he said the youngster was his son. At other times, he was saving him from a violent household. But it was obvious that Lucky had been present the whole time eventually, whether out of natural loyalty or whatever else. Officer Ryan was led by the dog, which had broken free deeper, to the child, and then to the... When the detectives ran Lee's microchip, the individual who had seized him did indeed. One of the stories it recounted was that Lucky had previously been a member of Eli's family dog, and Lucky also vanished when Eli did. Lucky was found in. Eli's family dog changed everything. What had appeared to be a random meeting between a police officer and a stray evolved into something much more profound, originating from a loss of loyalty and possibly fate. Officer Ryan Keller felt a pain he hadn't experienced in years, a recall of the kind of connection that transcends reason. However, the feeling of closure was short-lived that evening at the station. Ryan reviewed the files that had been received since Meow's arrest while sitting by himself in the evidence room. A copy of Eli's missing persons. The boy's school photo was clipped to the top of the report, which was open in front of him. His eyes were full of inquiry and innocence, suddenly carried a whole different weight in accordance with the original time frame. Eli had vanished from his backyard on a typical Saturday afternoon, when his mother had briefly entered. Marrow's truck was picked up by security cameras from the next block in the brief time it took for the gate to swing open. Idling 2 streets away, Eli and Lucky vanished in 20 minutes, although Ryan was disturbed not just by what had transpired, but also by the fact that no one had discovered them sooner. The farmhouse and the trailer. None of the trail Lucky had guided him along appeared on satellite data. The buildings were ancient, probably dating back prior to the digitization of municipal property records. They were in a sort of unclaimed, legal limbo. But if, after all, they hadn't been so arbitrary. Ryan grabbed a second file that had just arrived from the county. Several missing child reports dating back 15 years were found in the archives. A couple of cases had uncanny parallels. Kids were abducted from peaceful areas without being held hostage or arrested, and in each case, the child's remains were never discovered. He felt a shiver run up his back as he placed the reports next to each other. The locations, the technique, and the quiet. Afterwards, it was a historical pattern. Could Marrow have been related to? More than simply Eli Ryan, with his fingers tucked under his chin, leaned back. Known gloom in his professional life, but this felt like a personal matter, and Lee's intervention had spared one child, but the thought of how many others hadn't been that fortunate left him speechless. Titan Ryan went back to the hospital the following morning to see how Eli the boy was doing. Was aware, barely able to speak, and his mother was sitting at his bedside, holding his hand. When Ryan came in, she glanced up and gave him a soft, sorrowful smile while softly petting his hair. "Thank you," she muttered. "You brought him back to me." Ryan shook his head slowly as she roared. Did he not?" he asked, pointing to the door where Lucky was now sitting calmly. Pounding on the ground, the boy's countenance brightened slightly, but sincerely as he. Upon seeing the dog, Eli struggled to stand up and extended his hand to Lucky. Eli put his fingers in the dog's fur and held on as he leaned his head on the side of the bed and patted over. Though terrified he would go once more, it was a very potent moment in which Ryan would be with him for the rest of his life. But he kept his thoughts occupied as he watched the reunion because I was in custody. However, he was silent, and Ryan sensed that he wouldn't readily return to the Detectives from the station had already attempted to connect him to other disappearances, but the lack of proof was discouraging. It appeared as though Marrow had walked through the woods because there were no fingerprints, DNA, or witnesses. Like a ghost, meticulous, and worst of all, he had chosen places without. Later that afternoon, Ryan and the team went back to the farmhouse in the hopes of finding anything. Something nagged at him, even if they might have missed the crawl space being removed and the surrounding forest being swept. He requested that the crew send in ground-penetrating radar, which is typically used for buried remains or crime scenes, pass without producing any findings. Then, right before sunset, the scanner detected 6 feet from the radar revealed indications of a succession of minor disturbances beneath the pine needles and moss of the ancient swing. The air changed when they carefully and stealthily dug up little, irregular human-sized, surrounding them as though the forest itself was holding their breath. When they were finished, they had discovered Ryan stood with the meticulously wrapped and buried bones of 3 tiny children. Eyes were fixed on the twisted dirt as the tragedy played out piece by piece. His gaze remained silent as Lucky stood a few paces behind him, his throat constricted. Didn't abandon the location where Marrow had taken Eli. He had done this previously, and Ryan was now aware that Eli and Lucky had escaped the situation where others had perished. The only voices left to tell the narrative were the hands of a man who believed no one would ever find them. The quiet inn. After the final body was discovered, the woods became intolerable. Even the birds appeared to have disappeared, as if Officer Ryan remained still next to the new dig, where the smell of moist dirt and the forest itself were in mourning. Decaying with sticking to the air, the coroner's team delicately lifted the little object with calm coordination. Cloth-wrapped remains from the ground, while the forensic photographers meticulously recorded everything. Ryan believed that it was desecration, even though the work was. His chest constricted. How many times had he driven? It was incorrect, since it shouldn't have been required in the first place. How many patrols through this exact woodland did he have in the past year? Travel within a few kilometers of this location without ever imagining that infants were interred beneath his feet. Lucky sat next to. He remained motionless once more, as though he was also burdened by each life lost. He occasionally looked up, his ears twitching only slightly at the sound of machinery humming and detectives whispering. At Ryan, not for guidance, but for comfort, or perhaps to offer it. And Ryan initially wondered if he truly deserved that loyalty. Later that evening, following Ryan drove back in silence once the incident was cleared and the area was roped off, and Lucky curled up, as though he had always been in the passenger seat. The journey was lengthy. He couldn't get the picture of those shallow people out of his head. He couldn't get the graves out of his mind. And he kept thinking about Eli and how nearly the youngster had joined them if Lucky hadn't. Ryan gripped the steering wheel more tightly after realizing that escaping hadn't guided him through those forests. What most troubled him wasn't only the atrocity of the crimes. The system had failed, leaving blind spots, forgotten properties, and unresolved questions. Reports and the awareness that Marrow had lived in their presence for an unknown amount of time at the station where he submitted. Lucky was waiting with his tail wagging softly when he walked back outside of the car after his last report of the day. The gesture was tiny, but it caused Ryan to feel something. He knelt down to the dog and buried his. He whispered, "I should have seen this coming," with his furry fingers placing his forehead against Lee's shoulder. "Have located them all." Lucky remained in that spot and didn't move. Warm alive, Ryan wasn't a police officer at the time. He was just a man who had. Lucky wasn't simply a dog. He was the only one who could truly comprehend the severity of what he had seen. Of what had been lost the next day, Ryan paid Eli another visit at the hospital. With a tray of unfinished food next to him, the youngster was sitting up now, feeble but attentive. Mother went outside to give them some space, and Ryan sat down by the bed as Eli silently observed him clutching Lee's collar. On the one hand, the medical staff had granted permission for the dog to enter for a short period of time, even though it was strictly forbidden. Ryan cleared his throat. It had been a part of Eli's therapy and one of the only things that calmed him down. Eli didn't respond to, "Hey, champ," but he acknowledged him with a slow blink. "I wanted to ask you something," Ryan added, gently. "Do you have any recollections of the location he took you to Eli's gaze strayed to the window, and then gradually nodding, the boy said in a chilly whisper that my mother didn't want me. It was dark. No longer that I needed to remain silent, or she would forget me more quickly. Ryan's stomach dropped, and he was fortunate to ask Eli's. He stayed with me every night, sleeping with me, and his eyes warmed a little. Ryan swallowed the lump that was growing in his throat when I was afraid he might lick my face. Eli shook his head once, and I believe he left to look for her. Ryan nodded slowly, indicating that Lucky had gotten away. He didn't choose to go out of fear. However, Eli stretched out and stroked Ryan's sleeve out of love and hope, asking, "Are there more children?" Ryan hesitated as he asked, his voice barely above a breath. He wanted to keep the youngster from knowing the truth, but he was unable to do so. "Yes," he answered, gently. "However, we located them, and, thanks to you, no more children will suffer harm." Fortunately, Eli didn't weep. A network error occurred. Please verify your connection and try again if the problem continues. I merely nodded slowly. Please reach us at helphemopie.com. The days that followed developed like waves, slowing at initially, then collapsing with the weight of years' worth of ignored warnings, patterns, and inquiries that the finding of the graves in the woods had caused a stir throughout the county, but nobody wanted to ask out loud. Abruptly, the peaceful woodland outside Pine Hollow became the focal point of an extensive inquiry that extended well beyond. Ryan had anticipated attention from the town's borders, but not the oppressive pressure that accompanied it. Reporters, federal officials were surrounding the station like vultures, looking over all of Merrow's records and shedding tears. Families are calling for answers on youngsters who have disappeared without a trace. His phone rang nonstop these days. One thing remained constant throughout it all. Whether it was another lead, another demand, or an impossibly heavy burden, stayed steady. Lucky the dog, who had always been silent and vigilant, had developed into something. Within a few days, he became a department legend, and officers greeted him with somber nods and even a most. When Ryan passed by, the steely detectives melted. Ryan had brought him in as a rescuer, a witness, and a comrade, but now he was also a symbol. One night, as the sun began to set, the long amber shadows across the precinct parking lot, Ryan's horizon stood outside next to Lucky with a file in his arm. He looked around. The chilly wind was blowing through the trees in the distance, the same woodlands that had sucked up so many life and almost killed another. He knelt next to Lucky and sighed, carrying the aroma of pine and remembrance. The dog only gazed at him with those quiet, knowing, deep eyes that never wavered. "You know we're not done yet." Ryan gave a small smile before getting up and going back inside. He had recently received. It was a letter that altered everything. That morning, an anonymous mail arrived, addressed to. There was only one sheet of paper with Officer Keller's personal information on it. No fingerprints, no name, was merely a typed message that made Ryan shiver. There was only one cabin. If you're reading this, you've only seen a portion of the truth. There are more locations. Follow the symbol. A poor but recognizable sketch was attached to the letter. It was the same. He noticed a carved symbol on the farmhouse door TM, with a series of numbers underneath it. However, the sketch now featured an additional element, a little triangle enclosed by a circle, sign that Ryan had not previously seen. He laid out the maps on his desk, noting the cabin's coordinates and contrasting them with those from the letter. A pattern gradually emerged. The farmhouse, the trailer, and now two more, not simply a group, but a road. Places that corresponded with the coordinates. The thought struck him like a jolt. This wasn't a chance. Merrow hadn't just lurked in abandoned properties. He had selected and organized them. Perhaps this was a pattern or strategy. Ryan recognized the triangle and circle sign, and even a network. Seen it previously in a long-ago report, a closed case involving weird symbols, a network of possible cult abductions in upstate New York. At the time, it was written off as paranoia in rural safe houses, but nothing stayed. Arrests. But now it seemed as though a thread was pleading to be pulled. Summoned a department analyst right away and asked for access to all reports of missing persons connected to off-grid compounds, trailers, and abandoned cabins in known wilderness areas, the neighboring counties. He then distributed the documents on the table after retrieving the old cult file from the archives. Lucky was the one who jolted him out of his reverie. The dog had. Ryan had gotten up from his corner resting place and was now standing by the window, his tail still perked up. A dark automobile with a tinted engine and windows idled across the street as he followed his eyes, racing close enough to observe the plates, but too far enough to see them when the automobile moved away as he approached the window, he picked up a warning or coincidence. The phone and directed further monitoring of the station and his own residence. Whatever Merrow had been involved in, Ryan was starting to believe that he hadn't worked alone and that the inquiry was still ongoing. Annoyed someone. Ryan and Lucky sat with maps and data laid out by his side as darkness fell. He could now sense in his bones that this wasn't finished because of the fortunate youngster he had rescued was only one branch on a much darker tree, and it had been the secret not only to solving one puzzle, but bringing attention to something much more harmful. There were more kids out there, and time was running out. The days that followed were a haze of suspicion and hushed speculations about unresolved issues that curled themselves around old files, reports, and recollections as well. Ryan hardly slept, making it difficult for most people to return. His desk was formerly neat and organized, had turned into a battleground of overlapping maps, open documents, and satellite printouts. What troubled him were images and grainy photos of properties that no one had previously given much notice to. The blackness of what they were discovering was not the most important thing. Rather, it was the silence of that darkness. These were not crimes of fervor or despair. They were meticulously practiced by Ryan. Asked Marissa, a talented analyst and one of the younger police, to assist him in tracking down the coordinates from the enigmatic letter. She was keenly accurate and personally interested in cold instances, particularly those involving children who were missing. Her younger sister had disappeared. A summer camping trip 10 years prior. And even though her case had long been deemed cold, Marissa never really acknowledged that Ryan was unaware of that aspect of her story until he showed her the uncivilized triangle in a circle. She stopped when she saw the sign. "I've seen this before," she muttered as she went through her notes. "Not just in that cold file. It was engraved on the tree close to where my sister was last spotted. Nobody cared, saying it was just graffiti." Ryan glanced at her as her voice faltered a little, but she recovered herself. She shook her head, her eyes fixed. "I apologize for not knowing, but don't be." With each other's assistance, they plotted the symbols into a wider geographical map, and what came up was a ragged line that crosses 3 counties, with each point uncannily matching places connected to previous disappearances. Runaways had been blamed for some, unidentified causes for others, and numerous simply forgotten in silence. But now that they were viewed in this light, the links were unquestionably. There was an unmarked area of government-owned forest land in the middle of the arc that had no current. Most people avoided the area due to its lack of organized routes and development. Not because it was risky, but because it felt strange. The locals referred to it as the Hollow, which Ryan detested the name right away. He gazed at the map for a while, the lines creating a rough pattern of pain, and couldn't get rid of the impression that something horrible had been lurking for decades in plain sight. In the meantime, he still followed Ryan around and remained close to his feet while he worked, but his demeanor had changed. He was now more vigilant, more agitated. He would pace at night with his ears twitching and his nose pressed against doors. Windows. Twice he had snarled at nothing that roused Ryan from a short, agitated slumber. Seemed to sense something moving Ryan, as though the tension was getting worse. Started going over Mello's interrogations once more. The man hadn't said much since his detention, but one particular statement caught my attention. "I wasn't the only one," Mio said softly during a late-night session after Ryan had pushed a bit too hard. Had hollowed-out, muttering eyes. "There were others, but I just protected mine, Ryan." He requested Marissa to reinterpret Merrow because he wasn't sure what to make of it, and it made him feel cold. He thought she might get. She was calm and sharp, but not harsh, and she had gone farther than the detectives had. Sometimes mankind could tear down walls, and to everyone's amazement, it succeeded. Merrow only partially opened up. He withheld names and numbers. He hadn't been acting alone, though, and he confirmed what they were afraid. "There's a place," he remarked quietly, gazing at the table You won't find it unless it wants to be found, which is deep in the hollow. Marissa scowled. Where do they go? The ones who don't belong. Marrow simply grinned, and behind that wounded stare, Ryan could swear he saw pride. The forgotten ones, he said, the ones nobody missed. Marissa came back to Ryan after the interview, her face pallid. But Ryan nodded slowly, and he wasn't lying, at least not about anything. Then we moved into. She hesitated, but I believe it has never ceased. You suppose it's still active? And I think Lucky brought us this far for a reason, Ryan said that evening. Parked close to the ancient trailhead, which had long ago been overgrown with vegetation, after driving to the edge of the forest. Without an instruction, Lucky leaped out of the passenger door when he opened it. The dog smelled the air before turning to face Ryan. Almost certainly, they weren't finished. The past wasn't forgotten, and deep within the trees, someone or something was waiting for them. There was no sign at the entrance to the valley, and structure there were no borders, no warning signs, and no paths. Just where the trees became denser and thicker, the breeze seemed to stop, and even the birdsong completely stopped. When voices didn't reverberate and compasses twirled, the villagers referred to it as a cursed spot. Until he crossed the final visible portion of the well-known trail, Ryan had always dismissed that as superstition. Lucky listened intently as boots crunched gently over a bed of leaves that had not been touched by hikers or forest rangers. Body Low the dog always stopped every few feet, smelled, and then picked a path. Constantly moving forward, two search and rescue officers trailed behind them, one of them with a thermal scanner. Ryan had insisted on bringing them, not only as a backup, but also because of his satellite beacon on the other. Had spoken was accurate. They couldn't afford to get lost in the thick woodland. Confusing, and examples of individuals entering and never leaving have already been reported. The further they walked, even though the sky was clear, the weird things felt dimmer, and a shiver crept beneath Ryan's collar. There was no fauna, not even a bird or squirrel, and the air wasn't frigid. Even an insect hum suggested that the woodland had lost its ability to breathe. One of the search team members, Officer Keller, members murmured, "We're losing signal satellites dropping out. Mark your last location and keep moving," Ryan said. "We're not stopping now," they said in a tight, firm voice. They walked for. After almost an hour of winding among identical-looking trees, Lucky abruptly halted at a twisted cedar that. The dog smelled the base and started to circle, standing out among the pines. Ryan bent down to check the bark that was faintly carved into the tree, tail rigid. The triangle and circle symbol from the letter beneath it initials. This time G, or rather than TM, vanished. Another name, another section of the internet. Lucky's once sharp and purposeful bark. Then turned and started walking once more, this time uphill. They arrived at a ridge as dusk was starting to fall, and that's when they noticed a small compound below, partially hidden by the rising mist. A compound, not a trailer. 3 buildings constructed from repurposed wood and a clearing with corrugated metal and rudimentary fencing constructed from scrap materials was devoid of lights. From their vantage point, Ryan could see evidence of recent use, but the location wasn't deserted. Firewood, a line of clean clothing, and most importantly, a dim. He dropped himself and gestured for the others to remain low as a whiff of smoke curled from the biggest building. "Lucky, thermals have something," one of the officers whispered, crouching next to him, eyes focused on the center cabin. "To know." 3 signatures within the main building. Ryan's heartbeat accelerated if. They had to move quickly since there were still individuals here, and they had no idea what they were doing or if anyone else was in instant peril. But then he noticed movement. A little figure appeared from one. A child who was small and wobbly. He entered the clearing clutching anything in his hands. He was thin, maybe 7 years old, and barefoot. His clothing were disheveled. He turned and gazed straight up at the ridge. Ryan's breath hitched when he saw us one. Ryan's eyebrows narrowed as the officer murmured, "No, he knows we're here." They could pretend that a loud bang broke the stillness. A door flew open, and a guy charged, taking the toddler by the arm and yelling something incomprehensible into the clearing. The boy did not fight back. As he was pulled back inside, Ryan just let the item in his hand drop to the floor. "It was a stuffed animal," Ryan said. "Now," he muttered, clenching his jaw, were moving, already sliding down the ridge, with his barks resonating across the trees like war drums. Lucky surged ahead of Ryan. He was unaware that his gun-drawn heart was thumping louder with each step. He didn't care what sort of people they were going to encounter. What mattered was that another child was in peril. There would be no more waiting this time. The ridge's drop was steep, dangerous, and covered in roots that may twist beneath feet, but Ryan didn't pause for a second. He noticed that the youngster in the clearing was terrified and was being pulled like a piece of trash because of something inside of him. Had a resolution that was becoming much more fiery than obligation. This was no longer only a rescue effort. Lucky was already ahead, his body a blur, and this was justice. Between trees and fallen branches, his black fur weaves, and his rhythmic, sharp bark sounds like a call to arms. Behind them, the two officers tried their best to keep up with the rapid rhythm of their breathing due to the combination of the terrain and adrenaline. However, Ryan hardly noticed, as each step was accompanied by the same thought. No more kids, no more. As they got closer to when Ryan signaled the team to stop by raising his hand. He hid behind a tree, breathing heavily, and looked around the perimeter. He heard passionate but muted voices now. There were more. The youngster was still alive, and there was more than one man, possibly three, inside. Eventually, he turned to face the others and spoke in a firm yet low voice. Using purposeful, steadily moving waves, we initially enter the main building and remain silent until we get to the threshold if the youngster is. Inside, extraction is the top priority. There are no warning shots or hesitations because they've already crossed all lines. The younger officer's jaw tightened and he nodded. The second officer adjusted his. Lucky now stood at the edge of the cabin, his grasp on the rifle, lips clenched in a grim line. His muscles tense like a bowring, and his body was low with one paw up and his tail rigid. Studied him for a moment before getting up and moving forward. Only corroded wire from the compound's outside fencing provided much opposition, and splintered timber, through which they slipped before proceeding to the main structure. Ryan didn't want to know because the air was suddenly heavy with smoke and smell metallic, either oil or charred meat. Reached the building's side, raised his hand 3 times, and signaled for the others to flank him on the left and right. Knocked in the door with one vicious blow, and chaos broke out within. The room was 2 men swinging madly from a ceiling hook, dimly lighted by an antique oil lamp. Scurried to their feet, one lunging toward a side door, and the other grabbing for something beneath the table. Ryan yelled. Police remained still. As he looked around the room, he noticed the youngster crouched in the far corner, his knees drawn too. His eyes were wide and unblinking on his chest, but a bullet rang out before he could do anything. Ryan hid behind an overturned chair after one of the suspects fired blindly, his hand quivering. The other officer on the left flank broke through from the side, returning fire just wide enough to pin the man down. Shouted commands as he apprehended the second suspect who had fallen to the ground with his firearm. The firefight ended sooner. More than 20 seconds, yet it seemed like forever until the cabin's cacophony eventually ended. Was filled with the stench of explosives, smoke, and shattered wood. One man was down, injured but still breathing. The other was. Ryan, in handcuffs, hurried to the corner and knelt before the boy. It's okay, you're safe now, we've got you. In a voice that lowered to a near whisper. The boy did not say anything, but his shaking hands grabbed Ryan's vest and held onto it desperately. Ryan scooped it up. As he stood and turned toward the doorway, the blanket he was wrapped in held him tightly against his chest. At that moment, he observed Lucky standing motionless just outside Ryan's frozen ears and back. Steadily moved forward, his eyes following the dog's, and finally he caught sight of her. Another youngster, not much older than Eli, came out from behind the second building, thin and barefoot, and as quiet as a ghost. She didn't flee or cry. Instead, she only stared as another form moved behind her. And then 3 more kids, all of them moving slowly in the direction of the firing, attracted by the disturbance. Ryan's breath seized in his chest as he felt the hope of something finally bursting through. They hadn't simply discovered another. He turned to the officers behind him and said, "Radio, and we have multiple child rescues, repeat." They had discovered a prison. Numerous child welfare teams, trauma support teams, and doctors are needed. Everyone is the Officers went to secure the perimeter, and Ryan knelt next to Lucky once more, his eyes awed and incredulous. "You brought us. You brought us to all of them," he murmured quietly, and Lucky leaned in to press, gently placing his head on Ryan's shoulder. And for the first time since the start of this nightmare, Ryan let himself think that this might have been the start of the rescue's demise. The operation proceeded in a haze of anxious voices, flashing lights, and rotor noise. As a medevac helicopter lowered down, just outside the trees, blades sliced through the air. The forest, which had previously been quiet, having concealed countless unimaginable secrets, now roared with vitality and motion. Dozens of police officers going in precision trauma teams that are coordinated, gradually putting up field triage units and caseworkers. Ryan remained still for a time in the middle of it all, urging terrified kids into blankets and protective embraces. He looked around him, searching the clearing with an odd feeling of disinterest. The 5 kids were being cared for and numbered, each one stepping out of the darkness of confinement like a ghost into a world that had all but ignored them. And even though the operation was successful, the relief. He felt a heavy sensation in his chest, as if they were still standing on the brink of something deeper. He observed Lucky moving among the kids, silently and slowly, without wagging or barking. Intentional, his eyes lingering on each tiny face as though he were counting to make sure. There were none missing. One girl, with shaky fingers, put a hand on. Lucky didn't flinch as he leaned into her, seemingly aware of the weight of the. She carried silence, and it was while observing the injured that she discovered. Ryan realized something completely different from the barely healing. This wasn't the. And after making sure the kids were properly nourished and clothed, this was the surface. Ryan drew Marissa, who had come minutes earlier in a second wave of emergency thermal blankets, aside. People her tense, pallid features momentarily lightened when she caught sight of the kids. But as Ryan gave her the most recent file they had found inside, one of names, dates, and symbols in a tiny leather-bound notepad at the shacks. Others had their names crossed out. "This is a ledger," Ryan uttered softly. Despite the storm below, his voice was calm and quiet. "Marissa, it's more than just a record of who was present." As she turned the pages, her hands trembled a little. The handwriting was scratchy, yet careful. There were names with initials, names with merely ages, and names with odd symbols like runes, geometric patterns, and numerals. She glanced up at his pale face, in parenthesis. "How many times did Ryan take a breath?" 27 that. "We don't know," she said in a voice that was hardly audible. "We can read," and the others. "Some pages are broken, possibly on purpose, and include codes that we don't understand, but from what we've seen, as of right now, these might have been transit hubs or drop locations. Was where they relocated the children, not merely where they kept them." The idea struck like a ton of bricks. If that were the case, then this compound was only one spoke on a wheel that may have been turning for a long time, and the tragedy didn't stop here. Years, or maybe decades, may pass before anyone notices Lucky's lone low bark. Ryan turned to see him, standing at the edge of the tree, breaking the silence. He had assumed the same silent, alert position outside the farmhouse, with his nose to the wind once more and his tail motionless. Continued pushing through trees and foliage until he arrived at Lucky's stop. The dog's nose was pressed, sniffing a track into the dirt that led more into the hollow into territory, even to rescue, and away from the complex. Teams hadn't made it to Ryan, who was kneeling next to him, fingers grazing the disturbed soil. It was dim, but he stood and called over Marissa, pointing to the obvious tire tracks that had recently grown. She scowled. "Someone left not long ago. Survivors or handlers?" Ryan whispered. He turned to one of the tactical team leaders nearby and said, "In any case, we didn't get them all. I want surveillance. AK, 9 units sweeping that route and drones in the air within an hour. I know we've had our hands full, but we can't allow. This trail goes cold." The man agreed and hurried to get everything in order as Ryan. The final weight of what they had discovered started to sink into his bones as he turned back to the compound. Not simply the children in the ledger without names, the ones that are not struck out, the ones that they had saved but are not present. Still out there. Lucky came back to his side, reminding Ryan by rubbing his shoulder against his leg like an anchor, that although they hadn't failed, they hadn't finished yet. And as the sun, Ryan made a silent, solemn vow to himself as he sank beneath the trees that were casting deep shadows across the clearing. No matter what awaited them in the shadowiest recesses of the pit, they would not stop until, when the last child was taken home, the woodland was completely silent, not the kind of quiet one might associate with the peacefulness of nature, but the kind that intensifies the eardrums that hum with an unbearable strain just below appear like a paused breath that goes on forever, a quiet knot. Ryan stood at the edge of that silence, staring with a sense of calm but expectation. Lee's nose had followed the last known path of those tired tracks into the darkness up ahead, which was different from the escape premeditation was suggested by the mayhem they had discovered in the complex. Continuity, the now secured clearing behind him, was a flurry of floodlights and regulated voices, a temporary order. After planning the removal of suspects and children, but still ahead of artificial light and safe, Ryan could only characterize the somewhat less defined object that protocols laid as. He was suddenly aware of more than just the stress of unsettled business queries, but the obvious significance of what they had discovered was the removal of a curtain rather than the denouement of a perverse deed or a final goal. Beginning of a truth that has been suppressed for a long time by bureaucratic silence and willful blindness. He turned to face Marissa, who was watching drone footage next to him. Live-streamed images from above that are hazy due to fog and interference, but yet distinct enough to capture. Shows an old rail line covered in ivy, a short trail leading deeper into the woods, and most unsettlingly, the dim outline of another building, a rectangular shape nestled like a predator under the canopy. "We have to leave now," Ryan remarked in a low but firm voice while hiding in the tall grass. With determination, a tone that avoided controversy, but was derived from clarity rather than conceit. Marissa didn't argue, the kind of clarity that comes when there's nothing left to lose and nothing to fear. She only nodded, took a sidearm out of her holster, and looked at the safety. Her eyes were more intense than they had been earlier in the day. As though feeling the change, they were more concentrated and resigned to what they could find lucky. Trotted ahead once again in the environment without yanking on the rope, and Ryan now refused to clip on, always maintaining just within their grasp like a thread leading them into the unknown. They silently followed the trail only by two tactical officers, with the sound of static from a communication link becoming less audible as they proceeded farther into with their branches creating a tunnel of darkness. Hollow trees towered like ancient guardians, appearing too. At one point, Marissa murmured something about swallowing sound, light, and even time itself. Her eyes darted to a carved symbol on a tree, but Ryan missed it, and she didn't repeat it. Triangle and a circle that they had seen much too often, and he was certain that her words had something to do with her sister. Just after midnight, they arrived at the building, which was larger than the others and not constructed of lumber or scrap. Made from substantial concrete and wood, as if it had been a real building at one point, perhaps an ancient train station or, before it was lost and abandoned, a storage facility for forestry personnel. Repurposed by the wrong people, it was a locked steel object with no lights or sound. Door, and its surface was painted sloppily and faded crimson. Ryan recognized the numerals right away, and they represented the date of his birth. Dates of the kids' births, there is no more time for caution because the officers violated the door swiftly. Their movements were fluent and practiced, yet inside there was only darkness and no ambush or opposition. The overpowering scent of mildew, gasoline, and Ryan, who was far less recognizable, moved the first flashlight beam, piercing the darkness and dust to expose a corridor leading to other rooms. Except for the shackles on the walls, bolts on the floor, and a child's sneaker, a hairbrush, a few strewn about items, and an engraving. Concrete with chalk with a faded color that still shows a dog and a tree. As if stuck in recognition, Lucky stood motionless at the room's edge before cautiously entering and rubbing his nose against the wall. He made a single, deep wail that reverberated off the walls like a. The drawing Ryan had seen in the teaser weeks prior was the same one that was left unspoken for too long. This wasn't simply a Continue was the starting point, the starting point. And at that precise instant, surrounded by echoes of lost innocence, shadows of anguish, and the steadfast presence of a dog that had assisted him in navigating every conceivable turn of this nightmare, Ryan, that Marrow, wasn't the architect only one of many occupants of a building that was constructed with carelessness, maintained with indifference, and exposed only through the devotion of a creature that no one had considered pursuing. They had discovered a criminal network, had discovered a system, and now that they were in the quiet of its sanctum, they realized that it would take more. More than a single night, more than a single attack, more than even the bravery of a dog that persisted. Yet it already started, and in the weeks that followed the raid on the complex located deep within the Depression, that was sufficient for investigators. Wispy Ryan is dispersed among 3 counties, tracking down names from the notepad and pursuing hints of previous crimes. Discovered that he was vacillating between 2 realities, one influenced by the daily responsibilities of police questioning, press releases and debriefings, the other, more subdued and internal, displays a sense of weight brought on by realizing that the wickedness they had discovered had not existed in far-off cities or elsewhere. Scenery, but right there, just over the boundary of his own patrol route below. The peaceful forest canopy he had always assumed he was familiar with, but praise was given despite reporters' branding. Children's advocacy organizations wrote him thank you notes in droves, and Ryan took every word with a smile. Practiced nodding, and if it could be called that, the dog's sleepy ease, who was once written off as a stray, a wanderer, and now slept curled up at the foot of his bed every night. After all, Lucky had changed, and he had instead shown himself to be the compass they had all disregarded for far too long. He moved with quiet assurance and continued to monitor the door, but not in a way that was visible to others. Even though he was just slightly awake at night, he still did as Ryan said, but there was a tenderness in his voice now. During Eli's weekly therapy sessions, he would sit close to the fireplace or rest his head in his lap, as if finally, an unseen knot within of him had relaxed. A sacred obligation had been accomplished, and even though Eli was traumatized in ways that would take years to fully comprehend, he was gradually starting to. Initially, it had only been pieces, as he grasped for Lee's collar out of instinct when, terrified the way his eyes glowed when he saw sunshine coming in through a window, the soft hum he produced when drawing a house, a tree, and a dog repeatedly, but with time those fragments finally gave birth to words that were cautious at first, then more flowing, as they became more consistent and coherent. And lastly, abrupt, harsh bursts of laughter that caused his mother to cry silently. Putting her hands over her lips was not a sign of sadness, but rather of worry that she would never hear that sound once more. Ryan used to visit frequently, but he is no longer an officer. The case, which is currently in federal custody, has expanded beyond a Pine Hollow with coordinated raids across state lines that uncovered safe residences and transit hubs previously linked to names of missing children, rejected as deserted ruins, and accusations in the works that extended into distant circles of power, more than anyone had initially thought. But Ryan had chosen to avoid the center of it all, of failure or disinterest, but because he had already passed through the flames and gazed into the empty mouth of gloom, and he realized that his role was to assist restore what had been the peaceful aftermath rather than in the war room. Broken one tiny moment at a time on a spring afternoon that was especially clear, he perched on a hill outside of town with a view of a field where the foundation had been laid by construction workers for a brand new children's trauma treatment clinic that was partially financed by contributions that flooded in after the story went national and named after the kids that were discovered in the hollow at his side. With his eyes tracking a team of volunteers who were planting a little garden, Lucky sat quietly, his tail fluttering through the grass. Eli was also at the location, using a wooden shovel to dig in the ground. He placed seeds into the ground with considerably more care than someone his age should have, a determined expression on his face. Have mastered carrying, but maybe those also healing. Ryan inhaled deeply. In addition to the 27 names in the book, he considered the others, not simply the 5 they had saved, destiny that they might never discover. those that would only endure because of the marks engraved on timber through the tales of those who eventually broke the stillness. And he reflected on how fortunate he was to see how effortlessly the world may not have realized how nearly they had missed his trail and how many times they had relied on large actions or institutional endeavors, but on the silent unwillingness of one dog to walk away from a youngster in the dark. No awards were given for such courage, and no sufficiently large headlines were published. But there was peace, and Ryan eventually came to the realization that peace isn't necessarily accompanied with closure, or justice, or clarity. Sometimes it takes the shape of a child's hand. Sometimes it arrives in the form of laughing, where there was previously only silence while lying on a dog's back. Sometimes you come to the realization that the path was always there in silence, and that you were never the one guiding it, wishing you had the courage to follow.